Okay, welcome everybody to week 9 of the course. And so I just wanted to start off with talking about the reading quizzes. So overall, you should have them returned with the comments on them, so take a moment to look at those. Overall, everybody did a really good job. The only thing that I wanted to clarify a little bit was the idea of cultural capital. So cultural capital, Bonnie Norton, and we've talked about it a few times here. So basically, the idea is that language is cultural capital because it allows you to have access to a lot of new environments. So you have access to new groups of people, new environments. You have access to new jobs. You have access to promotions. So it's a very valuable piece of capital that you can have under your belt. The idea basically is that language is valuable, and so it relates to motivation because we have to when we're trying to convince people to learn a language, we have to make it so that people don't view it as simply a chore, but as something that is worthwhile. So something that they need to invest in. So we need to make it clear to people that when they invest in learning language, they actually will get substantial gains in return for that investment. Okay, so it's kind of a motivating factor here. So so cultural capital kind of relates to the idea, so people can actually see the utility behind learning a language, and so that's kind of it kind of promotes motivation in the instrumental sense. Also, it can promote it in the integrative sense as well. So there's that. So that's just something I wanted to make sure you understood. And I think overall there weren't really any common themes of problems on the other items. So for the most part, everybody did really well on the quiz. I looked at your mid-semester evaluations, and I'm happy to see that most of you seem to be enjoying the class. And some things I wanted to comment on. So I know there were some complaints. So that I'm not really going to change. I have changed a few. I will be changing a few things. So for instance, the last few reading quizzes I've changed based on your feedback. But for one thing, so one of the comments was that the readings and assignments were too many. I'm sorry if you feel that way. So I'm not going to change the amount of reading or the amount of assignments. I'm actually basing this course off of my own experiences in undergrad and what I was expected to do. So the amount of reading is about 40 to 50 pages a week on average, and that's about what I was expected to do as an undergrad. So I don't feel that it's too much, especially since we're not meeting in class. You have to do a little bit of extra work because of that. So we're not going to be meeting in class, so you have to do the extra work in that sense. So that like the discussion posts are meant to simulate that a little bit, and working with the readings and doing the quizzes are also meant to do that. So I think you're perfectly capable of doing it. I can see that you are based on your performance in the class. I know it's work, but I think the more work you put into it, the better you'll do, or the better the outcome will be at the end. So I mean, I don't like to give classes that are a lot of fluff. I like to make it a little bit more challenging, because the challenge makes it so you have to work more at it and work more with it. So I hope that ends up being more rewarding because of that. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to change that, but I have heard your comments. The late policy, also something I'm not going to change. I know some people have complained about the fact that you lose a lot of points if it's late. That's to prevent you from turning in the assignment late. Okay, so if there's no late policy there, then you can just turn it in whenever you want, and it creates a headache for me in terms of grading. And I feel like it makes it so you're not really taking part in the discussion with the class, or part of the expectations of the class in a productive way. Okay, so the late policy is there for a reason. So I mean, I don't want you to think that if you turn in something late, it's not worthwhile. I mean, 50% of the points is still better than none. But if you turn something in late, then it kind of makes it so that you're not really fully participating with the group anymore. And so that makes it so it doesn't quite work. Okay, so the late policy is going to stay as well. So sorry about that. But the group project, so yeah, so while I can't change it this semester now, since we're already over halfway through those, I think hearing you talk about it in your mid-semester evaluation seems like that was a common theme. People did not like the group projects that much, and I can understand. I can see where you're coming from in that. So I don't know if I'll be teaching this again. I probably won't be teaching this again at UH, but yeah, in the future, if I teach another online course, I will find a better way to do some sort of a presentation or something like that. So thank you for your feedback there. There was one other comment that I can't think of at the moment. I forgot to put it on the slide. I can't remember. I know like some, okay. And then anyway, so if I think about it, I'll come back to it. But it wasn't super important. It was just something I wanted to mention. But one thing that was important that I wanted to mention too was the suggestion that we do more with lesson planning. So yeah, and I completely agree with you. We should do more with that. It is a pedagogy class. Those are the P distinctions. So so what's going to happen is you guys voted, and so it seemed like everybody wanted to do the lesson plan instead of the 2 reading quizzes. Okay, so that will be uploaded either later this week or early next week, and you'll have 2 weeks to complete it. Okay, it's going to be around the same work as the reading quiz, but actually I may be willing to make it so that you guys can work together on that one. Okay, so it's going to be a little bit of a challenge, I think. And I think well, what'll happen is you'll get a mini lecture from me on how to actually construct a lesson plan, like what format to use and everything. And then I'll provide you with materials that you can use, or like you'll get a list of materials. You don't have to use them all, but you'll have to use some of them. And basically, this will be all geared towards a certain type of class with a certain group of learners. So probably an ESL class, I'm assuming, because that's what my experience is from, and so that's what I have a lot of materials for. And so what will happen is you have to use those materials, take the class into account, the characteristics of it, and kind of incorporate language-related activities as well as motivational-related activities. Okay, so yeah, so you'll see more about that in a little while, but for right now, we're gonna go on. Okay. Oh, I have it right here. Yeah, and then the final projects. Yeah. So, oh, this is something else you guys mentioned. So you wanted more in terms of you wanted more information about the final projects. I will be posting an assignment sheet later this week. I have it almost done, so it should be either later today or tomorrow that you get it. And there'll be a video with it explaining it a little bit more. And so I'll ask you to review both of those. So watch the video and then look at the assignment sheet. And then I'll open a discussion forum under this week's lesson and also next week's lesson where you can ask questions about it once you've looked at both of them. And then another thing, so you'll notice on the syllabus, it says that individual meetings are scheduled to happen via Skype, I think 2 weeks after spring break. So next week what will happen is I'll have a sign-up sheet on a Google Doc uploaded to that week's lesson, and so you'll have to figure out what time you can meet with me during that week on Skype. Okay, so yeah, so now that we've had daylight savings time here, so there's a 6-hour difference, so that makes it a little bit challenging, but I think it can still work out somehow. Okay, so so I'll give you some times, and then if none of those work, then we'll figure out something for you. Okay. Yeah. So just watch for that next week, and watch for the assignments in the assignment sheet and the video this week. Okay. So going into this week's content, so basically we have the motivational, so we're talking about motivational practices and how they relate to teacher perceptions and student perceptions and how effective they actually are. Okay, so when we talk about motivational practices, we find that certain motivational practices are actually not affected by culture. Okay, so when we talk about the things that teachers do to kind of encourage motivation in their classrooms, generally speaking, there are a lot of practices that culture, it doesn't matter which culture the person is, they're still effective. Okay, and I think the important thing to remember here is that students' attitudes and motivations are only related to the perceptions of strategies. Okay, so it doesn't matter which strategies you use as a teacher. If the students are not perceiving them, they will not be influenced by them. Okay, and so that was mainly the key point last week from, I think it was Bernaus and Gardner. Okay, so if you have to make sure the students understand the strategies that you're using in order to have them have an effect. Okay, so it's the idea of raising awareness amongst students. Okay, the more attention they can put towards it, the more likely it's going to happen. So the same thing happens in language learning in general. So if you draw attention towards a form, they are more likely to learn it. Yeah, so the same thing happens here. So if you draw attention towards it, the strategies that are used, they're more likely to perceive it and be affected by it. Okay, so basically we've come to this point now where we look at the L2 motivational self system. So this is basically where we are in terms of motivational theory and how we apply motivational theory into teaching. Okay, and so the L2 motivational self system is actually really nice because so I have basically the examples here. So you have the fact that it transcends national and cultural boundaries. So it doesn't matter which culture or nation the person is from. They can generally speaking, they can still visualize themselves in the future. Okay, so it makes sense. So it's compatible with conceptualizations of identity, so the person can actually figure out who they are, and then based on that, they can figure out who their future possible self will be. It's congruent with other L2 acquisition and L2 motivational theories. So we've seen how this is actually kind of takes everything all together and combines it into this one system. Okay, so integrativeness, self-determination theory, all that kind of comes together and combines into this one system. Okay, and then we have, so it explains emotional constructs involved in the L2 learning process. So for instance, with Poppy, we read that article on how anxiety has been brought into the system. So it explains how anxiety and other related emotional constructs are actually, they actually feed into the different aspects of the system. So the ideal L2 self, the learning experience, the ought to L2 self, all of that. Okay, and it builds on popular frameworks from motivational psychology. So so Dornier, when he made this system, when he developed it, the theory, so he actually based it off of the idea of possible selves by Marcus and Aurelius. Okay, and the idea that that you're more motivated when your possible self or the future self guide that you have is much more much different from where your present self is. So that's called discrepancy theory there. Okay, so there's a difference between the two. Okay, so it's an excellent theory because of all of those things coming together. Okay, so it has extraordinary explanatory power, and as a result, it is actually able to be used very well in the classroom. Okay, so when we talk about, so moving on into the readings for this week, so Poppy and Abdoladza, so they actually wanted to look at the relationship between teachers' use of strategies and the students' motivation. So they want to see how the teachers' use of strategies is actually affecting the students' motivation. Okay, they wanted to look at the relationship between teachers' practice and components of the students' motivated behavior, so their alertness, their participation, and their volunteering. And then they want to look at the relationship between the students' motivated behavior during class and the future L2 self-guides. Okay, so this actually adds to the Dornier and Guiteau article that you read for this week as well. So basically saying that, so they're basically looking within the context. So it's not just self-report measures, but it's actual observation measures as well, which is really important because we need to be able to move beyond these self-report measures because they're somewhat inaccurate. People often overestimate their motivated behavior, and they are, and I mean, they don't get the full picture. Okay, so like we said, like we've talked about before, you have a lot of survey data that's been, or a lot of survey studies that have been done in this area, and so they get a very holistic view, but they don't really get a very close view of what's going on with the students precisely. Okay, so this observation kind of lets us see, so how are the students actually behaving in class? We can actually operationalize it and observe it. And we can actually look at the teachers' actual use of strategies as well. Okay, so basically with their study, they looked at male students from the Iranian EFL context. They used the same measure that Dornier and Griotto used, so the MOLT, so kind of like that, like classroom observation, inventory. So they kind of look at what the students are actually doing. And they have the post-lesson teacher evaluation scale, so kind of two binary things that they're looking at. So are they competent in English or are they incompetent with English, for instance. And then they have the student motivational state questionnaire. So they're still using a questionnaire for self-report evidence, but they're comparing it also to what was actually observed. Okay. So we have here kind of the general findings. So teacher practices and student behavior were strongly related and generalized beyond national boundaries. Okay, so basically, yeah, so what we have here, so the teachers, the motivational practices that they actually used had a strong relationship with student behavior. So the students actually, their different behavioral aspects that they were looking at, they changed based on the types of practices the teachers were looking at. And so this actually supported what Dornier and Griotto found. So it finds that, so teacher practices and student behavior, even in this new context, they also have a strong relationship, just like what Dornier and Griotto found. Okay, so it's not related to culture per se, it's kind of related to an individual aspect of what's going on. Okay. Yeah, so they also found the strong relationship between teacher practices and the three measures of student motivation. So the first one was looking at the MOLT, and then the second one was looking specifically at the alertness, the volunteering, and then the I can't remember the third one at the moment. So participation, there we go. So they were looking at the volunteering, participation, and volunteering. They found that all of those relationships with teacher practices. So the more motivating practices, or the more of the motivating practices the teachers use, the more of those three measures of student motivation that they used were increased. Okay, so so for instance, the more the teacher used motivating strategies, the more that the more alert the students were, the more likely they were to volunteer answers. Okay, they did find non-significant relationships between the student behavior and self-reported motivational state. Okay, so which is interesting. So the self-reported state is generally you would expect that if there's a self-report, a self-report would at least somewhat correlate or relate to the actual observed behavior. In this case, it didn't. And so what Poppy and Abdullah actually suggest here is that actually they're probably basing their judgments based on the cultural aspects of what's prized or what's favored in their educational settings. Okay, so they're probably basing their judgment on the performance of tests as their motivational state. So according to their self-reported motivational state, the better they did on tests, probably the more likely they were to say that they were motivated, or they exhibited motivated behavior. Okay, rather than what they actually did in class. So they could still be very passive and not really participate in class, but still think that they were motivated because they did an excellent job on the tests that they were given. Okay, so yeah, so that's something to consider too. So there are aspects that actually of culture that actually do play a role. So in this case, you see student behavior and their perceptions of their own behavior. There's a difference there because of that cultural aspect. Okay. Now the actual practices, or the actual effects of the practices that the teachers have on the students' behavior, very different. Okay, so there's a strong effect there. Okay. Yeah, so no significant difference between the high and low motivation learners and the ideal L2 self. So they looked at the way that the learners actually rated their ideal L2 self, and then they kind of separated the learners based on their self-reporting questionnaires on their high and low end. Okay, so they found there's not really a significant difference when they looked at the high and low end of motivated learners. And their conclusion was basically that so Iranian schools don't really allow for the development of an ideal L2 self. Okay, so it's generally very teacher-centered, test-oriented, and so they're not really focusing on that. They're focusing on doing well on the test. Okay, so the idea here is like, so the ideal self is not available and accessible to these students. So the ideal L2 self is not playing a role in their motivation because of that. Okay, so there's something else playing a role in their motivation. Most likely the teachers' strategies, and also most likely it has to do something else with the probably external requirements placed on them by the environment. Okay, so yeah, so there's that. Yeah, and then they found, so with the L2 L2 self, there actually was a difference between the high and low group. So yeah, that's the higher L2 scores for the low motivation learners were found. So basically saying that, so lower motivational learners actually, they felt more pressure from the outside on them, so from external sources, okay, in terms of where they should see themselves in the future. And so what they found, what they suggested was, so the L2 L2 self is actually more associated with anxiety, right? So when we talk about the anxiety or the emotional states being incorporated into this L2 ideal, or this L2 motivational self system, anxiety has a higher influence on the L2 L2 self. And so low motivation learners, as they were observed and through their self-reports, maybe probably actually more through observation. So as they were observed, they actually were much more passive and didn't really participate as much in class. And so it makes sense that they have a higher L2 score because they probably experienced more, a higher level of anxiety because of that. Okay, so basically, what's the take-home message? So teachers' practices are strongly related to motivation of the students, okay? It's also important to remember there are other external factors that are taking place that the teacher has no control over. So for instance, the L2 L2 self. But for the most part, we see a very strong, and it was a very strong correlation. So they had, when they looked at the correlation, it was high, so it was significant, and they also had the effect size there. So they're talking about an effect size in the article, and so what that means is the higher the effect size, the greater the actual relationship is. So I mean, the significance doesn't tell you that much, but the effect size actually does. So if it's a higher effect size, it means that relationship is excellent, most likely. Okay, so we want to so the teachers' practices, yes. So they do tend to have some sort of an effect on motivation, although or some sort of relationship with motivation, but we can't really see which one is influencing the other. I mean, it's most likely based on theory going to be the teacher's practices influencing the students' motivated behavior, but I mean, you can still see that the students, but I mean, anybody who is taught can probably say that students' behaviors can actually have an effect on the teachers' practices as well. So so that it's all dependent there. Okay, so what can we do then? So this brings us to the Magid and Chan article. Okay, so basically, but they start off by saying, so teachers actually rank motivating students as the second most serious challenge that they face. Okay, and so we see that these motivational practices that they were looking at in Papi in Abdullah's article, they have an effect on the students, or they're related to the student behavior somehow. Okay, so what do we do then? So they actually talk about this program that they used in both Hong Kong and England, and it used imagery. Okay, so imagery is useful, and so they talk about its different uses, right? So it shapes people's behavior. It's used in things like sports, for increasing endurance. So medicine, so convincing cancer patients that to imagine themselves without the pain that they experience, and it works. Education, which we're seeing here, and then psychotherapy as well. So helping patients to kind of overcome some of the barriers that they come with. So it's a very valuable tool that we can use. And so it comes, basically is defined as like an internal representation of a perception of the external world in the absence of that external experience. So we don't really have the opportunity to experience this type of thing that's going on, but we can actually think about it. We can actually imagine it internally, okay? So there are two types. So there's the scripted and the guided. And so you see examples of both of these in the two programs that they describe. I mean, you don't have to be too caught up in the difference exactly, but like, so scripted is basically, so a script is provided on a variety of themes, and basically what happens is a person reads it to an individual or group, and then they kind of have their eyes closed and they have to kind of imagine what's going on with that as that script is read. Okay, so I think they have an example of it in the perfect interview. I think that one was a scripted one. I can't remember at the moment, but yeah. So I mean, basically, you have to think about the situation in your head and just imagine it. Everything that's going on that's described to you. The guided one is a little bit more free form. Okay, so it's kind of you give the listeners or listeners a broad theme, and they kind of close their eyes, and then they kind of make a fantasy or think about what would happen given that theme, and they kind of describe it out loud. Okay, so the idea here is that you think about your future self in these situations. Okay, you have to imagine your future self, and it's kind of used as a motivational practice. Okay, so you can actually do this as a positive way and a negative way. So you can have them imagine themselves in as their feared self, and also as their ideal self. Okay. Something that's important to remember here, I marked this when they mentioned it. So the future self guides. So sometimes people will try to basically make them the equivalent of goals, but that's not what it is. Okay, so both refer to future end states, and so I mean, yeah. So in that sense, they are goals. They are both goals, but the future self is actually cognitive, emotional, and visual. And sensory information. So you're thinking about all of this stuff. It's not just an endpoint that you're focusing on. It's something that evokes emotions, so you can be happy, you can be afraid, any of that. And then visual and sensory information, like as you're closing your eyes and you're imagining all this, you can kind of almost, the idea is like you should be able to, it should be so vivid that you should almost be able to like smell the smells in the air, or touch the ground, or something, whatever you're imagining. Okay, so goals don't encompass any of this. They actually are just cognitive in nature. They're just a list of things that you have to get done. Okay, so they kind of talk about these different intervention programs that people can use. Theirs are like several months long, and I mean, generally speaking, like teachers don't really have time to do all of this. So I mean, it's something that you'd have to introduce gradually into a class, right? And so what they have is these different things that they did. So they had like listing goals. So what goals does a person have? Drawing timelines. So how do they think? When do they think they'll be able to achieve each of these goals? developing action plans. So this can come in the form of like distal proximal goals. So having a person think about action plans in which they achieve certain proximal goals on the way to that distal goal. Considering feared selves, so negative scripted imagery, so making them think about these situations where they become something that they don't want to become. Okay, and then they have the ideal self tree. So this is the more guided aspect. So you think about the ideal person in terms of learning English or some other language, the career, and then the person's personal life. Okay, and then they come up with action plans based on like by drawing limbs on the tree, kind of. Okay, so yeah, so I mean it seems almost it's like very workshopy kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, if you've ever been to a workshop, these are generally the things that you do. And so what happens is it causes the students to actually think about what they're doing. Okay, so basically, yeah, so they delivered several workshops over extended periods, and then they found, yeah, so the workshops they delivered, so these methods that they use, they actually developed significant increases in the participants' vision of their ideal L2 self. It made it so people actually reported putting more effort into learning English. Learners became more confident in their English ability, and it made it so they became more motivated as their goals became more clear. So it encouraged them to actually think through their goals more often and actually list out what their goals were. So it made it so they were more motivated. Okay, and so basically, the lessons learned from this, they found, so the students actually enjoyed visualizing their ideal self. So it made it so that they had something to look forward to, in a sense. Chinese students could actually visualize, so that was actually surprising to the researchers, because it's not something that Chinese students are really taught how to do in the schools, according to them. So so basically, they're saying, so yeah, so they expected, because there's like not so much like so much in the way of like critical thinking or analysis taught in like a Chinese school, they thought, okay, well, students might not be able to think beyond right now or the near future, but they actually found happily that wasn't the case. So this kind of goes back to the idea, like, so the L2 motivational self-system, it goes beyond cultural boundaries. So here's an example of that happening. Okay, so regardless of which culture you belong to, you most likely have this ability to think about what's going to happen beyond the present. Okay, and to really make it vivid. Okay. Yeah, so something else I found, so it's important to explain the rationale of visualization to students for them to find it useful. And so this kind of goes back to last week too. I mean, we need to make sure that as teachers, when we use certain strategies, that we call students' attentions to it. So I mean, this goes back to the beginning of the lecture too, where I said that so students only are affected by what they perceive. Okay, so you have to explain to them what methods you're using and why they're useful, so that they can actually perceive it and find it useful and actually make use of what's going on. Yeah, so you have to make sure students can visualize. So sometimes students come in with like kind of a lack of a vivid imagination, and so in that case, it's not that they're doomed or anything and they can't do this. It just means that you need to provide them some training in how to do it. So start small and then work to bigger things. And then, yeah, so you need time so that students can concentrate. Okay, so so you need to provide, so the instruction or the types of activities that are included here, they need to be done in a way that the students aren't tired, there's not a lot going on around them. So for instance, I think sometimes, like in this study, the students were complaining, or they said that it was difficult to concentrate because they just come from lunch or something like that. So you need to make sure that when you do these types of exercises, that they come at the optimal time. Okay, so students should be able to focus on what's going on. Yeah, and then so yeah, you have to use plausible situations. So if you have a scripted or even a guided imagery exercise, they have to be plausible situations that the learners can actually see themselves being part of. If they're not plausible, the learners will just kind of give up. They won't see the purpose of it. Okay, so if they're plausible, they actually see how they actually can be related to their life. And you have to make action plans plausible. So part of this was developing an action plan. So if they have an action plan, but it's not something that can be realistically completed, that needs to be changed. So you need to interfere a little bit as the teacher. Okay, and so this kind of goes back to our discussion of the previous week of language learning beliefs. So the Bali inventory that Horowitz came up with. So you can kind of make sure that this doesn't happen or this isn't a problem by actually confronting some erroneous beliefs that the learners might have. Because oftentimes action plans, if they're not made, if they're implausible, it's because there's some unrealistic expectation that's placed on the learning process by the language learner. Okay, so you just need to make sure that happens. Okay, so that's the end of the lecture for this week. So for next week, what you'll do is you'll need to read the Dornier Chapter 4, which I'll upload today, and then also the McEwen and Takeuchi 2014, okay? So be sure to start working on your final projects and watch for feedback on your proposals. So I have your proposals. I'm looking at them gradually, so soon you should all have your feedback from me, okay? So if something is not clear about your feedback, you can always email me and ask, and that's totally fine, okay? So we'll go ahead and end it there. So have a good week, and yeah, good luck as you continue working on your projects.